Hey team, just read this book, False Black Power, by Jason L. Riley, and it's just a little short essay, I guess I would call it, discussing privilege, equality, and the Black experience in America. And I thought it was very interesting. It touched on a few different pop cultural things, stories, changes that could have impacted Black Power and kind of how they worked and how they didn't. So it talked about a pop cultural film that outraged a few advocates for the Black experience, big names, and other people went and absolutely just loved it. So perhaps the outrage served to get people to watch the film and to think about it. It was talking. It was a Black people talking to Black people, talking about how to get yourself on your feet, how to persevere and keep going. And it did talk about social elements of crime rates that do seem more prevalent to the people who are multicultural. And who are of lower socioeconomic status, also indicating that despite the fact they're like 12% of the population, Black people make up like 55% of the people in prison. Just different statistics. And I did take a sociology class that suggested that if you're looking at like blue collar crime, like more violent crime, or it is easier to catch people who are of lower socioeconomic status because people are actually looking at them as people who are disadvantaged and who would perhaps want to take law enforcement into their own hands, and so that's something that wasn't really talked about. Well, I mean, it was brushed on in the book, I guess, but it talked about Obama's presidency in that regard, and how punishments, like criminal punishments, may be deemed unfair because of that, and just the rates. He didn't really touch a lot on the rates between races, and they talked about his presidency and how he kind of danced around some of the racial commentary, just because he was obviously a big deal for Black people in American history, for white people as well, and so it kind of established the book mentioned that Black people did have they had good numbers in politics, decent numbers in politics, and decent representation, especially in areas with high numbers of Black people within the community. But it talked about the differences between having political power and having true power and being able to make change happen. And a lot of that, they said, kind of comes down to your skills, who you want to be. And Obama, it did mention in the book, Obama did push for educational reform and a lot of educational things, and that's getting skills, which does kind of reflect that same initiative. Some folks were not pleased because he wasn't making as much change. He wasn't pushing perhaps in all of the directions that they wanted him to help equality initiatives. But it also said that it was a big deal, and President Obama obviously was well loved. He had a very high approval rating, like 60%, as a president, with his two terms that he served. And so he kind of but he was a large symbol for Black power, equality, but it did also suggest that his politics and the fight for Black people, the recognition may have caused the backlash, and it was argued that it could have been the reason why Trump was elected. Partially was because he's kind of a known misogynistic type character, who doesn't have the same liberal background in civil rights and human rights for the minorities, which has been seen in his desire to get rid of those initiatives, that legislation for businesses. So he's not known for that, and they said that it might have been kind of in reaction to trying to make a difference, trying to help. And so sometimes trying to help can make it worse, or can cause lashing out, and you kind of see that too with with individuals, like any individual who is a not necessarily minority, but like low socioeconomic status, who feels like you're trying to help them. It takes away their autonomy, it takes away their independence, it takes away their power. And so it talked about finding your own power, becoming skilled, becoming talented, and kind of kicking butt for yourself. And because it talked about how legislation came about, like the civil rights, but the numbers were already in place, that the numbers were already getting better when the legislation passed, and that's probably indicative of the fact that society was changing and the Black power was improving, and so perhaps the legislation that occurred was not it said that it wasn't necessarily 100% effective in boosting those numbers more, but so it may have actually been because the numbers were already auto-correcting, were already fixing themselves, due to improved Black power, improved education, improved skill sets. So perhaps the legislation is not the primary focus that we should be worrying about. It's the education, and of course our education system is flawed, and you can argue that even if you get a degree, or where are you going to find a job in your field? And so direct applicability from a degree to work has been questioned, and so you have things like that in play. But the idea is, even after the Jim Crow laws and after slavery, even during segregation, and I kind of acknowledge, I had a recent realization of this as well, because I was looking back at pictures of a trip to Memphis, and that even though they were segregated, Blacks still had thriving businesses, and they were still serving Black people exceptionally well, and they were building those skills regardless. So they weren't, seeing them as impoverished, and seeing them as, lesser, doesn't necessarily help them. And and I think that's a good realization, a good thing to recognize. No one wants to be lesser, and they're not lesser humans. Just focusing on the education and the power will get them the respect and the money, perhaps, that they deserve to become affluent members of society, which will help boost that equality. So, and they did discuss too, becoming white, or trying to be socio-normative, to match the majority population. They discussed that as a thing, and not want, pull up your pants was mentioned a few times, and things like that. And I that was a big style a big trend in like the 90s and early millennium, and I know my white sister did that too, and so it wasn't it wasn't just black people, it was definitely just like a thing. Having your butt out, having your underwear showing, and things like that. And so, but it did talk about, you know, trying to dress nice, to emphasize your talents, and not to make yourself an other, and to put your best foot forward, so people aren't automatically judging you, but instead of seeing the power that you have. So, but then. I did think it was interesting to think of how to gain power, because you know, I was talking about like whiteisms, doing a lot of reading and getting educated in the traditional sense, but I think also looking at education from a perhaps more ethnic sense, or historically ethnic sense, looking at the oral traditions. I mean, I think that's where history started with everyone, was the oral tradition, you know, and you know, so looking at more multicultural educational styles and systems too is not a bad thing, but we want to see the outcomes that suggest equal power. And so and you know, what is respected in the modern era, and how can that shape the human experience. So definitely an interesting narrative. I liked that it had it went, you know, it had the argument, and then it had commentary in the book that you could read, and you know, some things you kind of agree with, talking about how some of the commentators that were listed as important to the narrative were kind of faded figures, that they were big, you know, 50 years ago, so suggesting that they have such power in pop culture today seems a little remiss, given that, no, you know, half the who hasn't heard of them, probably a lot of people, or they've heard the name but they don't really know what they had done, you know, that sort of thing. And so it talked about that, but then it said, you know, there, you know, and it did mention too that some people were just agitators, who were feeding off of the inequality to get their voice, you know, get their narrative, the equality narrative, and the for good outrage as the platform, you know, and they get a lot of money for that. And so it was kind of, their economy was pushing the unequal agenda, and perhaps thus perpetuating it. But it did, so that's kind of what some of these individuals were doing, was they were fighting for equality, and fighting for liberal democratic legislation, and trying to, you know, fight the man and ensure black equality by, you know, consistently talking about the continued inequality. And you know, that's, I would argue that that's a continual agitator, and that's not going to create positive racial interactions. And they said that it's, you know, they said that it was a potentially flawed way to interact in promoting black equality. But you know, they were agitators when they were younger and when they were, you know, in their prime, and they still have a lot of backers because of the affluence that they created by being loud. And so now they have the backings of associations, millions of dollars, even though they're not recognized or known in today's pop culture. You know, they still have affluence on a Google search, and they have a lot of people in cash that they can kind of throw around. So interesting for strategies for trying to create an equal society and trying to make people's lives better. So definitely worth reading. Thanks, bye.